We'll just wait a few minutes before we start. We're still having people join. I think it's top of the hour. We'll go ahead and start. Hi, everyone. My name is Chad Sloss. I am the Executive Director with the National Equipment Finance Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. We have a great program lined up for you on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. I first must obviously thank our sponsors for today's program. These we have different levels of sponsorship, as many of you know. Our diamond level sponsor we have two at that level: Bank Financial and Providence Equipment Leasing. At the gold level, we have Financial Pacific Leasing, and at the silver level, we have New Lane Financing. So we must thank our sponsors again for putting on today's program and helping us. Again, we have many different volunteers within the organization. And we have some great programs lined up for you in the coming weeks. November 12th, we have another program with Elliot Eisenberg, post-election forecast. November 19th, we have two panels lined up on business development and credit underwriting. So we hope that you'll continue to join us for those as part of this 4-part series with the virtual symposium. And then we also have a networking event lined up in December. So anyway, just wanted to mention those briefly. I'm going to turn it over to one of our educational co-chairs, Andre Clifford with Bank Financial. He's going to say just a few comments as well, and then we'll get into our program shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Yes, my name is Andre Clifford, and I'm with Bank Financial Equipment Finance. And I just want to take this time to thank all the attendees for taking time out of their busy days to join us on this session on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just give everyone an update on the upcoming events. As Chad mentioned, we have Elliot Eisenberg on November 12th at 1 to give us a post-election forecast, and he is electric to say the least. And then on the November 19th, we have 2 panel sessions, one being on sales, business development, and the other on credit underwriting. And we hope you can join us for those. And lastly, I just want to thank Chad, Stephanie, and Blair for all of your help with putting together this session. And I can't wait to see Robin's presentation. So thank you all. Back to Blair.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Robin today. So Robin Pollock is the Managing Director at Achieve Next. Robin is a business strategist with an expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She increases top line, bottom line, and shareholder value by teaching enterprises to leverage their DE&I initiatives for growth and success. Through financially focused, specialized diversity, equity, and inclusion services and solutions, Robin and the Achieve Next team help forward-focused enterprises create measurable impact on talent, enterprise performance, and maximize advantage in the markets. Robin has been actively involved in DEI issues for over 20 years. She has lectured and written extensively on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, strategic best practices, cultural change, communication, team collaboration, networking, negotiation, and effective leadership. Robin brings years of experience working with enterprises as a restructuring attorney and believes that aligning business and human capital is a catalyst for change. And with that, Robin.
Thank you, Blair. Thank you so much. And thank you to the National Equipment Finance Association for having me today. Really important topic. We have a lot to dig into. So again, thank you for having me. I want to let everybody know that please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions or provide any comments that you'd like. We'll stop a couple of times during the presentation to make sure that we're answering questions and everybody's on the same page. So I want to make sure that you're putting them in real time so that we're not missing anything. And then, of course, we will leave time at the end to sort of wrap up and get to any questions that we did not have an opportunity to answer during the program. So Blair is going to be my tech support today. As a former lawyer, not so great on the tech side, so you may hear me saying to Blair, "Oh, Blair, flip the slide," but she is helping me. So just wanted to sort of give you a heads up about that. And to let you know that really, I'd like this to be as engaging and interactive as possible. So again, please put some questions in the chat. I know that these formats are a little bit harder now that we're in COVID world, but certainly want to make this as conversational and interactive as we possibly can, given current circumstances. All right, so let's dig in here and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Blair, if you want to start flipping us, we'll get to the program. Oh. All right. So, really interesting times we are all living in right now. I mean, nobody could have ever thought that we would be at this crazy intersection. We've got obviously the pandemic, we've got economic crisis sort of going on, we've got an election coming up, and we've got the current cultural climate. Clearly, what happened with George Floyd at the end of the spring was really a catalyst for moving diversity, equity, and inclusion to the forefront. So of course, enterprises were talking about it, maybe not in the right way or sort of in a way that was not as strategic as they needed to be. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the current cultural climate and everything going on really was that catalyst for change. So let's talk a little bit about an arc that Achieve Next created at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is really, really interesting. We actually took, and this sort of arc may look familiar to some of you because it stems from the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, and really looking at how enterprises and individuals in enterprises, employees, we're sort of dealing with the different stages of the pandemic through those stages of grief. So you'll see there, shock, anxiety, a sense of loss. And of course, now we are in the rebound phase, really coming up to what is now a new next level normalization. So of course, when we first started, we weren't sure what was happening. People were going remote, was all a lot of anxiety and craziness. Now, I think a lot of enterprises have settled into this new norm. You've got people that are, of course, still working remote. You have some people in the office. You have some people in this hybrid. And I think there's almost been sort of a leveling off because this has gone on for so long. And of course, as we move through it, how enterprises handle their people issues is really critical to whether they rebound, as you see that arrow going up, or they sort of get into this cycle of decline and they're really not able to come out of this pandemic successfully. So, one of the things that is really critical is, the investment in people and how people are being treated during this time, and investing in the right people to take enterprises forward is really critical to that ability to successfully navigate this and come out on the other side. And of course, that goes to sustainability and competitive advantage. And really, a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as we are making sure that our people are feeling respected and valued and are heard is really critical to coming out of that curve in a way that is, revenue rebound and really being able to position enterprises for moving forward. So today we're going to talk about all of that. We're going to start off talking just very level setting around what diversity and inclusion actually means and why it is so critical from a business perspective, now more than ever. One of the things I want to touch on is the alignment between employee experience and customer and client experience. Really critical as a business driver to get underneath enterprises to get you to that next level. I'm going to give you a very high level, 35,000 foot discussion about how to approach DE&I at the enterprise level from a strategic perspective. And I think I'm actually doing an article for you that's going to be in your next or one of your next publications that'll do a deeper dive on that. So don't worry that we're sort of sitting up here. We will build on that in the article and give you some additional information. And then I want to talk about shifting from DE&I from sort of an enterprise level to really looking at DE&I from an individual level and talk a little bit about the concept of unconscious bias or implicit bias. Those terms are really interchangeable, and how bias can have be an impediment to having an inclusive workplace, and what we can each do as individuals to sort of help level set that bias and move us forward successfully. All right, so Blair, if you'll take us to the next slide, we'll start very high level with some definitions around what is diversity, what is inclusion. I think all of you have received a glossary. So you will see these definitions in there. They may look a little bit different than what's here. There's not really one definition of diversity and inclusion, and we'll get to equity in a second. But I want you to start thinking about what it means for you, knowing that there's no right or wrong answer. So certainly you can look in the glossary, compare it to what you see here. And of course, that glossary includes a lot of DE&I definitions. So diversity is really, as you see here, the full spectrum of human demographic differences. So it's race, it's religion, it's gender, it's age, it's sexual orientation, it's veteran status. It's a whole host of things. One of the things I want to stress about diversity is that oftentimes people do think of those visible attributes. So again, race, gender, age, those things are very visible. Diversity also includes diversity of thought. How you think, what your experiences are, what you bring to the table. We'll talk a little bit more about how that drives enterprise performance. But I want you to start thinking about diversity a little bit more broadly. Yes, it's what you see, and sometimes it's things that you don't see. Oftentimes, sexual orientation, or disability may be hidden. But I want you to think about it more broadly as well, about what we each bring as individuals that is different based on who we are. So inclusion. Inclusion is really, really important. And I often think inclusion is more important a lot of times than diversity, because inclusion is that feeling, as you see here, of belonging. It's that value, it's that respect, it's that full participation. It's the ability to contribute and to feel that you have a voice in a culture that is safe. Psychologically safe. So you are free to voice your opinion. You are free to be your true self, to be authentic, and to contribute that to the overall, goals of an enterprise. So I think, when I think of these two terms sort of together, I think obviously we need diversity because that brings those differences. But if we don't include those different voices, we can have all the diversity in the world and it's not going to move us forward. So let's talk about equity, and then we'll sort of put all of these together into why this is so critical to enterprise performance. So equity here, is fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people. So I really think that this picture that you're seeing, I love this picture because this really, shows you visually the difference between equality and equity, which are very different. So if you see here, these people staring sort of over the fence, equality is giving everybody the same thing. So everybody's here, we rise everybody up. You see they're standing on the exact same size block, but that's still not getting all of them over the fence. Equity, on the other hand, gives individuals, and particularly those that may be marginalized or underrepresented, so in this case, it's somebody that's smaller, gives each person what they need to get them sort of to that next level. So you see here, you know, the person in the blue shirt doesn't need any help. The person next to them needs 1 block, and then all the way to the end, they need 2. And that allows them to then be equal so that we can then rise people up together. So the concept of equality really presumes that everybody's starting on an equal playing field, which if you look at that visual, that equal playing field is not getting them over the fence. Equity gets underneath people, you know, gets them what they need so that you can then move forward together. So hopefully that just gives you some sort of background, high level knowledge. And I love this picture. I really think it represents, you know, how to visually, describe the difference here. Okay. All right. So why is this also important? Why does this matter? You know, we know that DE&I maximizes human capital and enterprise performance. And so you see some of the data here, and the data is really, really voluminous. I'm telling you, there are stacks and stacks of studies that have been done. This is one by McKinsey. There are other companies that do this kind of data gathering. So you see here, companies with diverse executive teams are 35% more likely to see better than average profits. And those with diverse boards of directors are 43% more likely to see better than average profits. Like, those are big numbers. Those are a big deal. And Blair, if you want to just go to the next slide, there's some additional information there. And we can sit there for a couple of minutes as we talk about why DE&I increases, enterprise performance, sustainability, competitive advantage. So we talked about diversity of thinking. So why is diversity of thought or diversity of thinking so critical to this business outcome? It's because when you have different viewpoints, different perspectives, different experiences contributing to decision making, contributed to problem solving, you end up with better results. You end up with more innovation. You end up with better results to problems, because what's happening is when you include all of those voices, you have the ability to debate, to dissect, to really have dissent in your conversations, to challenge each other, which is really going to be what's going to end up driving better business decisions and better innovation and better performance. If everybody thinks the same and you sort of have what's called a groupthink mentality where somebody says something and everybody agrees, you're not really digging into, well, could there be a better solution? Could there be a better answer? In my different experience, this is what I have found. So, we say like 2 heads are better than 1, but if the 2 heads aren't different and you're not including all of those voices, you are not going to get those results. So including different perspectives really makes us smarter as a group, which again leads to better performance and better decisions. So there's also a correlation. I think, Blair, we're on to the next slide. There's also a correlation between your employee experience and your customer experience, your EX or CX. And Blair, I think if you want to just advance one more, that quote will come up. Thank you. Wait, let's just go back. Perfect. So there's a quote here that talks about the link between your employee experience and your customer experience. So a couple of things here from a DE&I lens that are going on in the world and in the marketplace. So the first thing is that customers and clients are increasingly diverse. You may all be experiencing that in your companies, where you're seeing that the people you are actually doing business with and the people that you're serving and that are your clients and customers are actually more diverse, because demographically as a country, we are becoming more diverse. And those clients and customers really expect and want to work with companies that are also diverse. So they want to know that the companies that they're working with and the people in those companies, understand them. They want to know that they sort of get them. So, for example, if your client is a minority-owned business and everyone that they interface with at your enterprise, is not a minority, they may feel that your company doesn't fully understand, their needs as a client being a minority owned business. Now, of course, that does not mean that only people of color can work with that company. That's not what we're saying at all, but they do want to see that you do have a commitment to diversity and that you are a top performing enterprise because you've got diversity and inclusion and diversity of thought behind all of the advice that you're giving them or what you're recommending them or the financing that you're presenting to them. So, there are also companies that create internal focus groups, or oftentimes they're employee resource groups, where they are grassroots groups of similar employees that come together. So if you've heard of, companies having a women's group or, an African-American group or a Latino group, those are employee resource groups. And companies often use their existing talent as a benchmark and a touch point when they're rolling out a new product or they want to test something against a certain demographic to ensure that that product, and the marketing resonates with that demographic. So if you don't have those employees there, it's sort of hard sometimes to test those kinds of things. And really the overarching business driver here is that if your employees feel valued and heard and included and invested in, they are going to be performing more effectively and efficiently. And they are also going to interact with your clients and customers in that same positive way. So customer service improves, customer relationships are stronger. So that alignment becomes really, really critical to driving your business. That EXCX alignment is a business driver. And of course, in this current cultural climate, you have to actually be, walking the talk. It's not enough anymore to just sort of have a statement on your website or to say, yes, we support diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you want to attract the best, employees, retain them and attract the best customers and clients, you really need to have a sustained commitment to diversity and inclusion that includes action. It can no longer just be a statement. It's not enough anymore. Now that we are in this environment, sort of having those statements isn't enough. Employees are demanding that there are actual actions, looking at what is your leadership team looking like. If you've got a board, looking at what your board looks like, looking at who you're attracting, do you have a diverse pipeline and what are you doing to attract those people? So all of that is tied to business and business performance. And as we try to all make our way through the pandemic, and get to the point of, real revenue rebound in 2021. We really need the best people to take us forward, so going sort of full circle back to where we started with the ARC, that's really critical to financial performance for companies. Our people are our greatest accelerator or decelerator of business performance. And so DE&I really becomes a critical driver to getting underneath organizations to move us forward in that revenue rebound. So I'm going to pause here for a second before we talk a little bit about how to do this, again, at a very high level, and we will do a deeper dive in the publication. So certainly if you're interested in a deeper dive after we get through our 35,000 foot, you'll have that opportunity. I don't know, Blair, if you're able to let me know if there are any questions or before we get to our polling, if anybody has anything in the chat that they want clarification on before we move on.
No questions yet.
Okay, we have a very smart group here. I am impressed. So we know that we're doing this work for both human capital and for enterprise performance reasons. So I alluded to this high level 35,000 foot view of how to make this work. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll move off of the enterprise sort of focus into the more individual focus. So before we get into that, I have a couple of polling questions here. I'm curious as to the group. So the first question Blair's going to launch is, how many of you have a DEI initiative currently at your enterprise? So if you could take a couple of minutes and just check off yes or no. So we'll get some data on that. And Blair, I'm assuming that these two will get the results together. Is that how this is set?
Yes, it'll come
Okay.
together. Mhm.
Okay, so answer that first question, whether you have a DEI initiative currently, yes or no. And if you don't, are you thinking about embarking on one? And we'll give everybody a couple, a second or so here to fill out the poll, and then we'll see where we are with the group that we have. Blair, and you just let me know when you're going to close the poll. We'll give everyone a fair warning, and then we can see where where we fall here.
We've about half of our participants have voted. We're at
Okay.
about a minute, so let me know if you want to wait, like,
Yeah,
about
we'll
10
give
seconds or so
everybody-
longer.
Yep, we'll give everybody another couple seconds to vote. Interesting. I'm a very data focused person, so love to hear what where you sit on this, just so we sort of have that information from this group. Okay, why don't we go ahead and sort of see where we fall out, Blair?
All right, so it looks like about 8% do have a DEI initiative, and a 92% who answered said no. And
Okay.
then for your second question, we had 58% saying yes and 42% saying no.
Okay, great. Awesome, thank you. So hopefully, this next part that we're going to talk about a little bit will give you some general, again, high level tools and tips around some of the things you should be thinking about if you are thinking about embarking on a DEI initiative. And of course, again, we'll do that deeper dive as we move forward. So Blair, I think we can move to the next sort of substantive slide after we get through this. So perfect, thank you. So for those of you that currently have one, and certainly for those of you that are thinking about one, and those that even answered no, that after this conversation may think, wow, I think I need to take this back to my leadership team, or throw this out as something that we need to be thinking about. The key to this is really to approach it in a strategic way, using a framework. Approaching DE&I in sort of a haphazard kind of, I hope something sticks, let me just throw something, against the wall and hope that it does what I wanted to do, is really not something that works. So using this process of assess, analyze, and adopt really gives you a framework of how to start approaching this kind of work. And you approach it with the understanding that Rome was not built in a day. So this is stuff that takes time. You're really talking about behavior change and culture change. So it takes time. So we have to be patient as we roll out these processes. You can't just turn on a dime. So it's really a little bit of a longer term investment. And we'll talk about a little bit about prioritization. So, it's really critical to start with that assess phase. And it's some kind of assessment of your workforce, whether it's an enterprise-wide survey, or you're doing focus groups, or you're doing interviews. It is absolutely critical to set a baseline of sentiment for your employee experience around DE&I issues. So we're talking about questions like trust and belonging and psychological safety and equity and fairness. What is your employee experience? Because if you don't set that point A, you don't know where that point B is, and certainly you won't have the ability to get between those 2 points. So setting that benchmark is really, really critical. Oftentimes, people will come to us and say, look, we need to attract more diverse people, or we need to do something else, and the reason we need to do this is X. So when you actually ask people, the answers that you're getting are often very different, and it can change the trajectory of what a company wants to focus on. So in order to be the most effective and efficient, you really want to ask and have that hard data. And what that data allows you to do is to take you to that next step, that analyze step, where you're actually creating a strategic plan or a roadmap. as I said, over time, so that you are using those metrics and the data and the KPIs to figure out where is it that you need to go. And then, of course, we help you in that strategic planning process prioritize where to start. So that, do you want something that's a quick win? Do you want something that, is going to take a little bit longer? Where's the greatest pain? That's the analysis that needs to be undertaken so you know where to start. And that actual implementation is the adoption phase. And when you're looking at that, you want to look at it across those 4 talent employee lifecycle verticals that you see below. So it's talent acquisition, talent development, leadership development, and succession planning through a DE&I lens. So you're looking at where, again, am I going to have the greatest impact? Where can I make the greatest amount of change in the shortest period of time? Where is it that I want to invest longer term to start changing some of the, processes to impact performance? So again, this is very, very high level, but it is the concept of having a financial focus, a data-based focus, a strategy that you are executing over time with measurable impact that is going to, again, take you from point A to point B. And this is where you are going to get the business benefits that we talked about early on. If you're sort of throwing things up and praying, you're just not going to get there. You're really sort of spinning wheels and wasting a little bit of time and resources. So think about how to roll this out in a strategic, data-based way for actual results. Okay.
Robin, before we move on to the next slide, we did have a question come in from one of our board members, Scott Wheeler, and his question is, inclusion is about respecting all people internally and externally. Respecting others is a natural instinct, goal, or objective for most every business. So why is inclusion so hard for businesses to address or implement?
Well, I think that that's actually a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about next, which is the concept of bias. I think that bias and unconscious bias is really the greatest impediment to reaching that inclusion. It is a normal human lens, and we're going to talk about why we have bias and what it means. But I think the impact of bias becomes that blocker to an inclusive workplace. And bias is unconscious. So it's not that we are purposefully trying to exclude people. I think part of the way we are wired lends to that. So Scott, let's talk a little bit about bias. And then if that question is not fully answered for you, ping us again, and I will do a little bit of an exploratory conversation with you to really get underneath. But I think we may answer your question as we move through the next section, because really bias, and we'll talk about this, really impacts those 4 employee lifecycle verticals all through an employee lifecycle experience. That is where it has the greatest impact. And that's where it can really impact somebody's feelings of inclusion, when they are operating in your enterprise. So, those biases can have an impact on, from who is hired to how we're hiring people to the barriers people face, once they're in an enterprise, to their development and their ability to ascend, what opportunities they get, what opportunities they don't get. So I think that, that's really where that inclusion piece, we have to be very intentional and very deliberate to sort of overcome that bias to maximize inclusion, and to make sure that everybody feels heard. So let's shift a little bit here from that sort of enterprise umbrella into the individual biases that we all hold, because of course, enterprises are made up of individual people. So, the more that we can get underneath our own biases and the more that we can understand about them, the greater impact we as individuals can have at the enterprise level, again, around, people, process, and performance. So we're going to talk about the people piece as it relates back to the enterprise piece that we just talked about. So let's talk about what is bias, because I think this will answer the question to a large degree around why it's so hard and why inclusion really gets sort of the raw end of the deal, as a result of this. So you'll see here, bias is a positive or negative preference for a person or a group based on attitudes, stereotypes, and prejudices. So bias, first of all, is real. It is scientifically proven, and it is really very much wired into how we as humans operate. So there are two really, really important concepts that I want everybody to understand about bias. And the first one you see on the slide there is in red in all caps. And it is, we all have bias. We all have bias. So let that sort of sink in for a second. If you are a living, breathing, human on this earth, you have bias. I have bias. Every single person has bias. So bias is actually scientifically the way that we take in information that is constantly coming to us. Think about all of the information that comes to us, thousands and thousands of pieces of information a day. And if we didn't have a framework or a filter or a way to make assumptions very, very quickly based on the information that was coming to us, we literally would not be able to survive. Like our heads could not, they would explode. It's just too much coming at us. So this is the way that we filter information. It is an automatic response. It is done in milliseconds without any conscious knowledge. And it is based on our lower level thinking. So you see here, lower level brain. You heard about the reptilian brain, like our very basic automatic responses. That is where bias sits. It comes from how we grew up, where we grew up, the experiences that we've had, where we've lived, what our birth order is. It's all about the things that make us who we are, form the basis of our own individual bias. So bias is not a values-laden concept. It's not good or bad. Again, it's how we are wired. It becomes problematic when it impacts, again, unintentionally, how we are interfacing with other people, decisions that we're making, things that we're saying, things that we're doing. So I think there's sort of a misconception that bias is bad. Bias itself is not bad. Bias is just simply our human wiring. It's when it impacts other people and decisions that we're making, that's when it can have a negative impact. So that's the first thing. The second thing about bias is that it is about impact, not intent. So think about what that means. People tend to judge themselves on what they intended. Well, I was just trying to help, or I'm just, trying to be nice, or I didn't mean it that way, or I was just kidding. That's all fine, but bias, unconscious bias is not intentional. So nobody would suggest that you are racist or sexist or homophobic or any of those things. That's not what bias is, which is why it doesn't matter what you meant or what you intended. It's the impact that it has on the other person that's important. So, again, we don't intend to be biased. It's how we're wired. And we need to sort of reframe that. It's not a blame situation. So to say, well, I didn't mean it that way, that's fine. No one's suggesting that you did, but it did have a negative impact on somebody else. And that's where we need to be open to having conversation, having discussion, to your earlier point, including somebody's feedback or experience, in our mindset, because again, it doesn't really matter what we intended, it's how we impacted someone else. All right. So I want to do a little exercise here. And I'm going to ask you, obviously we're not together, but I'm going to ask you to take a little bit of time in this exercise as we flip through a series of pictures. Blair's going to leave these pictures on the screen for not an incredibly long time, maybe 10 seconds or 15 seconds or so. I want you to look at the pictures, and I want you in the chat to start populating the chat with your first reaction to the pictures that you see. So you're going to see these pictures and they're going to evoke a very, a reaction from you. I want you to just think of what is that first reaction? What is that lower level brain reaction? Don't think, well, I should put this, or, Robin wants me to think this way. I want to know, what do you think and feel? What's the first word or so that comes into your mind when you see these pictures? And then we'll be able to have a little bit of an interactive conversation with the chat around your responses, okay? So don't overthink this. This is not a test. This is what you think when you see these pictures. So Blair, if you want to start the first one and then sit on each one about 10 seconds or so. And please put your responses in the chat so we can share with each other in real time what your thoughts are, since we're not together in one live room. Okay, go ahead, Blair. You can go to the next one. Are you able to flip it up? Thank you, sorry. Okay, I think that is the last one. So let me see if I can pull this chat up, Blair, so it's not too overwhelming for you. I think I can. So let's go back to the beginning. So look, I recognize that these pictures are sort of in a vacuum, right? So you have to sort of think about if you were, out in the world, and one of these people sat next to you, on a plane, once we're able to fly again, or, on a bus, or they were your coworker or somebody you were interfacing with, thinking about them in a context really sort of helps bring to life what some of the thoughts are. So I'm looking at some of the comments here, certainly model, pretty for the first one. I mean, that, you may be more inclined in the real world to open a door for someone that looks like that, or strike up a conversation with somebody that looks like that. That's pretty. That's a model that, evokes that sort of feeling from you. What about, the guy with all of the tattoos and the piercings? He's always somebody that evokes a lot of conversation. I don't know if anybody rebellious. Okay, Scott said rebellious. Chad said painful. Think about the snap judgments or stereotypes or assumptions we make about somebody like that, and think about how that sort of filters in to the workplace. So, could that person ever be a forward-facing employee for you? Or would you not even hire that person if they sat down for an interview because they are so sort of striking? So, we make assumptions about that person, but we don't know who he is. He could certainly be, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar startup. He could be anything, and he could, we make assumptions about who he is and why he maybe did that or how he's expressing himself that may be completely different from who he is as a person. We may say, okay, we're in banking. I could not put that person, on the front lines of interfacing with a client because of the stereotype or the emotion it might, build up in a customer when he might be the smartest, most successful banker on the planet. So it really gives you a little bit of an idea of the assumptions that we make about people from the way they look. And of course, this is looking because this is pictures, but we do it when we're looking at resumes. We do this all the time when we're walking down the street, when we're sitting next to somebody, when we're meeting somebody for the first time. We make assumptions and impose stereotypes on them without knowing who they are and what they're really about. And that is how the role of bias can impede inclusion. You may not want to hang out, with the woman in the hijab because you may feel that, I don't know, is this woman, and I'm, people say this, is this woman, a terrorist, or I'm not comfortable with Muslim people, or I can't see her face or her, beyond, she's all covered up. I don't trust her. Lots of things bubble up based on people's experiences and perceptions and what they hear. And it can really impact, inclusion in the workplace. Are you asking, that woman to lunch with your group of friends? Are you reaching out to the guy with all of the tattoos and asking him to lunch? Do you feel comfortable approaching, the man in the wheelchair because you don't know what to say and you're afraid of saying the wrong thing? So all of that really impacts our ability to be inclusive. And I'm hoping, Scott, that sort of gives you a little bit of context to answering your original question. So just want to touch on two other concepts very quickly. And again, these are complex concepts, but I want to sort of inoculate you to these. Blair, if you want to flip to the next slide. You may have heard these terms, micro inequities and microaggressions. Again, very, very complex concepts. We could do an entire, session like this around them, but I want to start, introducing these concepts and these words into your vernacular so that you have idea, if somebody's talking about these things, you have an idea of what they are saying. So again, very complex. This is by no means, doing anything more than barely scratching the surface. This is not an in-depth conversation, but we can certainly come back and have further conversations another time about these concepts, but important for you to know what they mean and know what they are. So you see some examples here. Micro inequities are defined as a slight that demeans or marginalizes the recipient. And they tend to apply without any regard to whether, the person that, you're speaking to is in a protected class. So they're not with respect to race or gender or ethnicity. It's really just almost sort of common courtesy type behaviors and how we interface with each other. So again, interrupting somebody, introducing somebody glowingly and the other person, with just his or her name, expecting people to accommodate your time zone. So these are just really simple things that we often do not think about. So again, they are subtle forms of bias. They are unintended. It's just how we're wired, but they have an unintended consequence and impact with respect to the person that you're dealing with. So think about that in your daily behaviors with your colleagues, with coworkers, with your clients and customers, because it happens all the time. Microaggressions are a little bit more insidious because they are an act that stereotypes or denigrates the recipient, and it is almost always related to a person's status. So you see, again, some examples here. This is a common one. I've often heard a lot dealing with Asian people, employees, where people will say to me, yes, I'm Asian, and I get, well, where are you from? And I answer, well, I'm from Philadelphia. And they say, no, where are you really from? And that's very demeaning to that person, because the person is from here, from Philadelphia, and they're an American, and there's an assumption being made that because they're of Asian descent, they must be from, China or Japan or another Asian country. So think about those kinds of things. Again, they are never meant intentionally, but they have very significant implications and impact on people. And I have to tell you, these are really, really hard, particularly microaggressions, because it really requires you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and saying, how am I, able to think about how I'm interacting with this person? Could it be interpreted in a way that's different than I intend, which is just really, really hard to do. So I'll give you an example that happened to me in real life. I was actually, before COVID, at a gym, like in a large class. There were probably, it was a weekend, there were probably 50 or 60 people in this huge, workout class. And the woman who was leading the class was biracial. And it was right around the holidays. And she, tended to talk, a lot during the class, and was somehow talking about, Christmas and the holidays. And she sort of said, who here doesn't put up Christmas lights? So I raised my hand, a couple of other people raised their hands, and she said, what do you mean you don't put up lights? I said, well, I'm Jewish. That's not, we don't celebrate Christmas. We don't put up Christmas lights. And she said, well, do you have a tree? Do you have a Christmas tree? And I said, no, we're Jewish. We don't celebrate Christmas. And so she was having this conversation with me in front of 60 people. And I have to admit, it was very, very uncomfortable. So certainly she didn't mean to call me out. She didn't mean to sort of, open up this kind of can of worms, but it opened. And there I was, sort of feeling a little bit marginalized and a little uncomfortable that we were having this conversation. And she was sort of so incredulous that I didn't put up Christmas lights or have a Christmas tree, not fully understanding it's obviously, for religious reasons. So again, that's a real life example that actually happened to me. And she didn't even think about that, because her frame of reference was that she celebrates Christmas and she puts up lights and she has a tree, and doesn't everybody. So it's easy to see how these things are difficult for people to manage, but it's really, really critical to think about them as best as we can for that, inclusion piece, for people feeling comfortable and safe and valued and respected, wherever they are, particularly, in the workplace. So again, difficult conversations, often uncomfortable conversations, but I want you to be familiar with them so that you can be open-minded, so that you can have discussions with people where you're learning and taking that on. And that definitely helps build relationships and trust between people. All right, so I'm going to pause here for a second. Blair, I don't know if we have any other questions before we get into the impact of individual bias in the enterprise. I just want to pause here because it's a lot of information.
We don't have any questions right now, but if anyone's listening that has one, please feel free to write it in the Q&A, and we will get to it as soon as possible. Okay, awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the impact of individual bias. Then we can flip to that next slide, and as we talk about that. So yes, of course, all of these things that we're talking about, life cycle, talent acquisition, development, leadership development, and succession planning are all enterprise functions, absolutely. But as we alluded to earlier, we all play an individual role in each of them, because enterprises are made up of individuals. So when it comes to talent acquisition, we need to think about where we are sourcing our talent. How are we getting our talent, and what can we do better when it comes to looking at diverse talent? How do we change sort of the hiring models we have to sort of fish in a bigger pond, to look at how we can expand to get more people into our pipeline. It's interesting. There was recently the Wells Fargo CEO got himself into a lot of hot water when he basically said, we can't find any Black talent
to bring into the bank. It's not that we don't want to, it's just not there. And certainly that isn't true, and sort of set off a whole firestorm around the comments that he made. It's about how you are sourcing and how people's individual bias is going into the process of how you are acquiring talent. And it's all the way from how we write job descriptions to how we, get resumes in and review those resumes, to hiring, to interviewing, to hiring. When we are going through those processes, if we can be aware of our individual biases and the role that those biases play, we can certainly be more intentional about overcoming them. So, it happens that, like, if you are interviewing somebody and they happen to have gone to the same college that you did, or they played the same sport you played in college, that can cause you to have an affinity bias towards them. You like them off the bat, no matter what they say or do, because you see yourself in them. You went to that college, they've got to be good. They played the same sport as you, they've got to be good because you played that sport. And that can really cause you, unintentionally and not being aware of the fact, that you think more highly of them, again, because you see yourself in them. The converse is true. You may think somebody's not a good fit in the hiring process because you work long hours and the person you're hiring happens to be a millennial, and you hold a stereotype bias that millennials don't work that hard. So you may automatically just eliminate that person without really getting into their skills, how they behave in certain situations, and what else they can bring to the table. Bias also impacts what's valued in an organization and how people are invested in. So that goes to the talent development piece. What kind of support and investment are we making in our people? And does everybody have the same access? Does everybody have the same opportunity to development? Or is bias creating unintended barriers? Going back to our picture of the people standing on the blocks, are there barriers to people's development that are in place because we're not treating people equitably? We're not giving each group of people, what they need. Oftentimes, underrepresented groups don't have the same access to mentors or to sponsors. They may not be included, in client meetings or business development opportunities, or get the same kind of training. So we want to think about how bias can impact somebody's trajectory. And of course, that goes to leadership development. How are we developing our leaders? What are we doing to give people stretch assignments? What are we doing to put people through leadership development programs? What are we doing, again, to sponsor and mentor people that may not naturally have somebody to go to? How are we being intentional? So it's really critical, again. And then finally, succession planning, about making sure we have the right people to take us forward to address the changing needs of our clients and customers, which we talked about in the beginning. Succession planning is a really, really big diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. We have, so many C-suite teams coming to us and saying, we all look the same. We know this isn't good. We know we're not making the best decisions, but we can't sort of wave a magic wand and get rid of everybody. What do we do? How do we become more intentional about making our C-suite team who's leading this enterprise look more like the people that we're looking to attract and retain, and more like the people that we serve? Because we know if we do that, we are going to be serving our clients and customers better. So again, a lot of times we need to look at the fact that oftentimes women, racial minorities don't have the same opportunities and access as a result of bias. I know plenty of women who have had opportunities usurped from them because somebody is trying to help them and let them go home, to be with their kids, but they're taking opportunities away from them without asking. So they're making an assumption that, Jane would rather be home with her kids. We're not going to take her to this client meeting, or we're not going to ask her to travel. We're not going to ask her to, to do anything that's going to take her away from her kids. And it comes from a place of it comes from a good place. So nobody wants to conflict Jane, but then they're not giving her that choice, and her development becomes impeded and she's denied access to opportunities because of bias, because somebody else making a decision for her. Happens a lot of times. You may say, oh, I'm not going to ask this person to come to the sporting event with us. They don't like sports, as opposed to giving them an opportunity and basing that decision on a stereotype that's held about that person, and whether they want to go, to play golf. So really thinking about how bias impedes these processes, and how we as individuals really have the ability to change the impact of bias on our talent. And I think this is important to also think about in terms of our relationships and our interactions with clients and customers. We can just as easily, say something that is a micro inequity or a microaggression, or take a biased approach with our clients and our customers, or we may treat clients differently because of bias. If you think about gender bias, do you deal with customers that are of different genders differently? Do you assume that if you're dealing with a man, maybe, especially when it comes to equipment or machinery, that man, knows more or has more decision-making ability, than a woman? There's the impact of cultural bias when we're dealing with clients and customers. If someone has an accent, does that impact how you interact with them? Or if someone is very young, do you ask for somebody more senior? So all of these things are examples of how bias can impact our relationships, not just with our talent, but with our clients and our customers as well. But don't fear, we do have the ability to change our interactions and to change the course of the impact of bias here. So Blair, if you take us to the next slide, we'll talk about some strategies and tools to begin to overcome bias. Again, overcoming bias takes time. It takes intentionality. It is about behavior change. So it is not easy, and it certainly does not happen overnight. So again, recognizing that biases exist and that we all have them is really the critical first step to overcoming bias. So it's not whether we have them, it's how do we manage the biases that we have? How do we sort of turn the flashlight on ourselves and sort of stretch our comfort zone and expand our worldview, to think about, how our experiences, are impacting other people. So I think that we need to challenge ourselves to really think about that. Is there a bias that I hold that may be unintentionally impacting the decisions I make, how I lead, who I give work to, who I go after as a client, who I invest in, and how that employee experience and customer experience alignment is playing out. So we really need to do a little bit of a deep dive, and we'll have a tool at the end that'll give you a way to start doing that. One of the other things that we can do is use a process I call recognize, realign, and revise. And really what this goes to is self-awareness. Being self-aware enough to know that, hey, wait a minute, what I may be about to say or do could negatively impact the person that I'm interacting with. Let me realign my thought process. Let me think about what that person, how they may be receiving what I say or do, or interpreting it. And if I put myself in that person's shoes and think, wow, I might be impacting them in a way that I don't intend, how do I revise what I ultimately say or do, so that I am not, negatively impacting them, without intending to. So, this sounds like it takes long, but it really doesn't. It's really about sort of slowing down that automatic response and sort of pausing for just another second, going through this process before you say or do something. And thinking about it. The more you sort of start using that higher level brain where you're going through this, couple of seconds of analysis, the faster you do it, and it actually becomes, sort of part of your DNA. So you're certainly not, sitting there and analyzing every interaction for 10 minutes before you speak. That's not what I'm suggesting, but it becomes sort of habitual to say, wait a minute, if I'm dealing with somebody that is different from me, if I say this or I do this, are they going to interpret it in a different way? So sort of pausing gives you that chance to sort of go through that process fairly quickly, and potentially realign. And of course, you know, we skip this part, or even if we do this, we may not get it right. And the corollary to this is really that ownership. If somebody says to you, hey, you know, you called me out in the middle of a gym class and were sort of put me on display for my religion, that didn't feel really good. That person has to be able to own that and say, you know what, I didn't intend that. I understand how that made you feel. I thank you for telling me, and I'm going to think about that and how I can do better next time. That again is how trust and inclusion and relationships are built. So evaluate your employee lifecycle processes. We touched on a little bit around how bias can impact your processes at your organization. So think about that. And one way to do that is to go back to that assess piece that we talked about and consider, you know, engaging in an enterprise assessment to really get underneath what the experiences of your people are. And you can certainly ask them questions around bias and around access to opportunity, and whether they feel that if they want to progress, that they have the equal opportunity as everybody. So thinking about asking is always a good way to start evaluating your employee lifecycle processes and how you are trying to strip bias from those processes so that you are, you know, have a more inclusive and equitable culture. Next is to be an ally. I think this term should be in your glossary. You know, being an ally is really about people who have the ability to stand up and step forward for other people. So it's about leaning into your own discomfort and being willing to challenge yourself and others, and to speak out on others' behalfs when you have the opportunity. To not be a bystander if you see bias having an impact, but to actually stand up. So one of the things, an example of this, couple of years ago, women that were staffers in the Obama White House were noticing that when they were sharing ideas in meetings, and this happens a lot, you know, not just in the, you know, former Obama White House, but when women oftentimes share ideas in meetings, they can sort of be overlooked. And then when that same idea is brought up by a man later on in the meeting, it's sort of looked at as the greatest idea that ever was. And, you know, this is, again, very common. There are studies done on this. So again, women are sharing ideas in meetings that are overlooked, and then a man puts forth the same idea, and then it gets the attention that it deserves. So this was going on in the Obama White House and in staffing meetings. So the women came up with a concept that they called amplification. And what it was they essentially stood as allies for each other. So when this would happen and a woman's idea was overlooked only later to be you know, put forth by a man, another woman in the meeting would say, you know what, John, that's such a great idea. You know, I'm so glad that you know, you are on the same page with Mary. It's great that, you know, Mary had that idea and you've bought into it. So again, that's called amplification. And it's an example of how to be an ally and stand up for people that are being marginalized or disenfranchised in any situation. Get out of your comfort zone. So if you find that you view a certain group with discomfort, or somebody in your company that you feel that, you know, you're maybe a little hesitant to approach, get out of that comfort zone and make a conscious effort to learn more about that person or more about that group. And, you know, when you are making decisions, consciously seek input from those who have a completely different perspective. Don't surround yourself with people who think the same as you. Actually go out and ask for a contrary opinion, because that, again, is how you begin to build better problem solving, better decisions, more innovation in how you're going out and approaching things. So again, addressing bias is really about behavior change. It takes a lot of intentionality. It doesn't, you know, happen overnight. Awareness is that first step. Which I hope that we brought some awareness to these concepts to everybody today, but really thinking about how to make a conscious effort to change behavior and really put some of these processes into play. You know, how are things done here? How am I working to change culture? How am I holding myself accountable This is really how you drive impact, at the individual level, and then of course, rolling up to the enterprise with people, process, and performance, and how you're actually doing things. So I'll pause here for a second. We have a video that I love that I want to show everybody, but I want to make sure that we're sort of, if there's any questions or anybody has any comments about what we talked about. So Stephanie, I see, wait, you know what? I don't see that question. Stephanie, oh, we likely have member companies in geographic areas that don't have a diverse population, therefore a less diverse pool. Their business does operate nationally and does have a diverse customer base. How can the business make efforts to diversify their employee base and or ensure diversity of thought in their business? So great question. So interestingly, I do think that COVID has given us an opportunity, because so many people are working remotely. It really has given us an opportunity to expand our geographic footprint. So just because you may be located somewhere that doesn't have a diverse population doesn't mean that you can't expand your pool, given the fact that remote work is now so popular that you can pull from different places that may be more diverse. So it really does allow that sort of ability to expand the pool that we're fishing in. I also think that, obviously there are places in the country that are more diverse than others, but I don't think there's anywhere that has no diversity. So I think it's about being intentional in how we're going out to source talent. Oftentimes, we'll hear that companies say, we can't find anybody. We're not diverse here. The area's not diverse. I can't find anybody. And when you dig a little deeper and ask them what they're doing to look for diverse talent, they're doing the same things they've always done. And those things never really worked, and they're still not working. So I think changing strategy, if you're recruiting out of college, are you always going to the same places? Are there colleges, even if they're not sort of historically Black colleges or colleges that cater necessarily to diverse demographics? Are there colleges that just draw for, more diversity? A city school may be more diverse than one that is out, in a more rural area. Are you partnering? Are you involved with associations or professional groups, much like this one, where there are diverse people or are specifically more diverse? So, if you're, are there companies associations that cater to diverse demographics? Start thinking about how to partner with those, how to sponsor those, so that again, you're building relationships and expanding the pool. So I think it's about being a little bit more creative, looking at where you're sourcing, not doing the same thing over and over again, and getting a little creative from where you're sourcing your talent. So hopefully that answered the question, Stephanie. All right, so we have a couple more minutes here. Blair, why don't we share the video, which is one of my favorites, and then we'll talk about a couple of resources that we're happy to make available, and we'll let people get back to their day jobs. Hopefully this is able to work, Blair. I don't know.
Is it not playing?
It is not.
Oh, okay. Hold on. I'm sorry. Hold on.
Here we go. It looks like it's going now.
Okay. I was watching it without all of you.
Oh, I hope you liked it. Let's see here. I'm still not seeing it. It's up, but it's not playing. I don't know. Here we go. I don't know if people, I can't see, I don't know if people can hear it. I'm not hearing it. Yeah, no sound. If we can't make it work, it's okay. We'll make the deck available. I'd love for you to see it all together, but if we can't make it work, yeah, for some reason, it looks like it's playing sort of, but it's not, there's no sound. It's all right, Blair. We'll make the deck available so everybody can watch it on their own. If it's not gonna load properly. Technology. We can just put the deck back up and finish up. I think we should probably be on the second to last slide, just so I can share some resources with folks here. Perfect. All right, so a couple of resources. Yep, we're good. So a couple of resources for everybody. Oops, we lost it.
Oh gosh, okay. Hold on.
We'll go back to chat. I'm kidding. So just a couple of resources here that you'll see. And again, we'll make this deck available. We'll just get that back up so you can see it. And you can leave the screen if it's messing it up. All right, so one of the, perfect. All right, here we go. So one of the things we have available for you is it's an assessment called the Cultural Impact Quotient, the CIQ. And when you get the deck, you'll be able to click on that link and it'll take you right to that assessment. And what it measures is the DE&I maturity of your enterprise. So certainly for those that have embarked on a DE&I initiative, you might want to take this to get a sense of where you fall on the continuum of maturity. And it also sort of gives you a roadmap of things to consider as you move through that cycle. I talked a little bit earlier about being able to sort of test our own implicit biases. So I've given you the link there for the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. If you get on that link, individually, you can sort of test your own bias, and it's very, very eye-opening. So it really does certainly prove that we all have bias, and I think you may be surprised where those biases fall, based on who you are. And the last tool there is, it's just a new video. It's an animated, cool video that Achieve Next has just done, and it really walks you through the DE&I process. So a little bit more around what we've talked about today, around assess, analyze, adopt. Something fun. It's one of those animated ones where you draw and it explains. It's a teaching tool. So thought that might just be fun for all of you to check out. And Blair, if you just flip one more slide, certainly to the extent that anybody has any questions, wants to reach out, wants to ask a question that you didn't want to ask here, wants to just talk to me about anything we've talked about today or anything diversity, equity, and inclusion related, here's my contact information. Feel free to send me an email or pick up the phone. Always happy to talk and help strategize and provide any resources that I can. So I don't know if we have any last minute final questions. I know we answered a couple throughout. But happy to take any last minute ones. And if not, turn it back over to your team, Blair.
All right, let me see. I'm waiting to see if there's anything else that pops up. Robin does have a few minutes to answer a few more questions if anyone would
Sure.
like to pop anything in the Q&A. But I just wanted to let everyone know that is on here that this is being recorded, and it's such valuable information. And I would encourage you to share it internally within your own organizations and with your other colleagues, also the glossary, and then we'll make the slide deck available as well so that you can share that. I think that it's very important that we as an association are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the more that we can kind of send around this information and have more and more people learn and get on board with us, I think the better off that we will be. So much so that the NEFA board actually has approved a diversity, equity, inclusion committee, which will be coming soon. So if this is something that you're interested in, please contact me. We would love to build up this committee and kind of get this going as something that we can advance within the workplace. Trying to see if there's, so far there's no questions. Like you said, very intelligent group. No one
Yes,
has any today.
absolutely. If anything pops up again, feel free to reach out. I'm here.
Yes, and when we circulate the slides, people can reach out to you directly. I know that some people are at the beginning of their journey with diversity, equity, and inclusion and just might not feel comfortable asking these questions live during the chat, but might be coming to you separately to ask those questions, or maybe more specific instances happening within their own associations or organizations.
Absolutely. Happy to answer anybody's questions and again, provide any resources, and advice that we can.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. That was a beautiful high-level overview. I know there's so much more information there, and we can definitely dive so much deeper here. And we really look forward to working with you again in the future. And this was just, our first, presentation into diversity, equity, inclusion as an association, with hopefully many more to come.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I just wanted to do another quick reminder that Chad had already touched on, but we have two more events as part of our virtual funding symposium. We have one with Elliot Eisenberg, Elections, Employment, and Equipment Finance on November 12th from 1 to 2:45. We did actually extend the time because Elliot was generous enough to do a Q&A session following his presentation. So there's a little bit longer time for us to take advantage of our time with him. And then also on November 19th, to finish up our virtual funding symposium, we have Selling in COVID Times and Credit Underwriting, 2 panels with your peers. So please join in there. You can go to the NEFA website and register for those events there. And that's it. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Robin.
Thank you.